American farmland has become Wall Street's favorite alternative asset, and everyone is watching China, even though Chinese investors hold just 0.02% of it. That is the story being told, at least. Chinese investors quietly acquiring American farmland near military bases, senators delivering speeches, cable news running segments with ominous satellite imagery, and honestly, the concern is not irrational. The idea that a foreign adversary could position assets near a nuclear missile installation deserves serious attention. But here's the number nobody puts on screen. Chinese investors hold approximately 277,000 acres of American agricultural land, which sounds considerable until you place it next to the total. United States has roughly 1.3 billion acres of privately held agricultural land, and Chinese holdings represent 0.02% of that figure, 0.02%. The political energy being directed at this problem is, by any measurable standard, wildly out of proportion to the actual scale of it. And while that argument plays out on television, something else is happening in the actual dirt. Since 2010, foreign ownership of American agricultural land has expanded by 85%, which translates to 21 million additional acres transferred into foreign hands over roughly 15 years. The investors driving most of that growth are not Chinese. They are Canadian, they are European, and they are renewable energy companies building wind infrastructure on American pasture land, and they face almost no comparable scrutiny because they come from allied nations and because wind turbines do not make for alarming television. This is not a story about espionage. It is a story about how an entire asset class, the soil beneath America's food supply, quietly became one of the most sought-after investment vehicles in institutional finance, and the people most responsible for reshaping who owns the land that grows American food are not foreign adversaries. Some of them run American hedge funds. One of them is Bill Gates, who holds his farmland portfolio through his investment vehicle, Cascade Investment, LLC. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what farmland actually is as a financial instrument, and why institutions started paying very close attention to dirt around 2008. Before the financial crisis, farmland carried a reputation as a sleepy, illiquid asset, boring in the best possible way. Returns were modest, volatility stayed low, and the main buyers were farmers. Then 2008 arrived and equities collapsed, bond markets went strange, and investors started hunting for assets that held value, generated income, and bore no relationship to the chaos unfolding on Wall Street. Farmland checked every box on that list. The numbers since then tell a striking story. Since 1992, the NCREIF Farmland Index, which tracks returns on institutionally held agricultural land, has delivered an average annual return of 10.15%. That is not farmland performing like a modest store of value. That is farmland performing like a very well-behaved growth stock, with the added advantage that it does not disappear when a tech bubble pops, because people still need to eat. The value of farmland assets tracked by the 7 largest investment firms, institutions like NCREIF, through its Nuveen Natural Capital Division, which manages one of the largest agricultural land portfolios in the world, climbed from $1.8 billion in 2008 to $16.6 billion by the end of 2023, which is nearly a 10-fold increase across 15 years. 2024 brought something the index had never recorded before. For the first time in the index's entire history, the NCREIF Farmland Index posted a negative annual return, coming in at minus 1.03%. Every single prior year, without exception, the index had moved upward. And that's when institutional logic kicks in. When an asset class posts its first losing year after 3 decades of unbroken gains, The typical response from large investors is not to exit the position. It is to treat the dip as a buying opportunity. The institutional farmland story is nowhere near finished. So where does that leave the people who actually live and work on this land? The USDA places 30% of American farmland in the hands of non-farmer landlords, meaning people and entities that own the land but never work it. In earlier generations, this occasionally meant a local businessman or a retiring farmer leasing a field to a neighbor. Today, it increasingly includes publicly traded real estate investment trusts, pension fund vehicles, and private equity structures. Two publicly traded REITs illustrate how completely the institutional machinery has been assembled around this asset class: Farmland Partners and Gladstone Land Corporation. Both are listed on the NASDAQ, and through them, an investor can now acquire a stake in American soil through a standard brokerage account with the same ease as purchasing a share of stock. The forecasted value of U.S. farm real estate in 2025 sits at $3.67 trillion, representing 83.6% of total U.S. farm asset value, and the average price per acre reached $4,350 this year, up 4.3% from 2024. For a working farmer trying to expand an operation, or a younger farmer attempting to enter the industry at all, those figures carry real weight. When the competition for a parcel of land includes a pension fund optimizing for long-term, inflation-hedged returns, the entire auction dynamic shifts. You are no longer bidding against another farmer who needs the land to farm. You are bidding against an institution for which the land is a line item in a portfolio, and the consequences extend beyond individual auctions. This is, at its core, a food security question about whether the structural incentives of institutional ownership align with the long-term stability of the food supply. Now here is where the foreign dimension of this story gets genuinely complicated, because it is not all wind turbines and Canadian pension funds. In 2023, North Dakota officials blocked a Chinese company called Fufeng Group from constructing a corn mill near Grand Forks Air Force Base, after the U.S. Air Force specifically concluded the project posed a significant threat to national security. The following year, President Biden ordered a Chinese firm to physically dismantle a cryptocurrency mining operation it had built near Wyoming's Francis E. Warren Air Force Base, which happens to sit on top of a nuclear missile installation. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are cases where proximity to sensitive military infrastructure and foreign land ownership became a real, adjudicated national security matter. A Government Accountability Office review published in January 2024 found that USDA's data collection under AFIDA contained errors, that the single largest Chinese landholding in the entire database had been counted twice at some point, and that the collected data was not being shared adequately with national security agencies. The government's primary tool for tracking foreign land ownership near its own military installations was, for a measurable period, double counting the biggest entry in the system. That is not a reassuring sentence to have to write about national security infrastructure. Forget what the official disclosure numbers suggest about the accuracy of this data. People inside the national security apparatus had been flagging these gaps quietly for years, and it required a formal Government Accountability Office audit to surface the problem in a public document. The current administration's response has been to accelerate. The National Farm Security Action Plan, announced in July 2025, laid out 7 points for defending American agricultural land from foreign adversary influence. And by December of that year, the USDA confirmed that entities and products from foreign adversary countries were immediately ineligible for federal lending programs and the Bio-Preferred Program. Then in January 2026, the USDA launched a new digital reporting portal for AFIDA, replacing what had been a paper-based system for submitting disclosures. A paper-based system, to be clear, for tracking who owns land near nuclear missile bases. Worth sitting with for a moment. The enforcement picture is also shifting. USDA assessed $1.2 million in AFIDA penalties across 2024, the largest single-year enforcement total the program had ever recorded. But place that figure next to the forecasted $3.67 trillion in U.S. farm real estate, and $1.2 million in penalties starts to resemble the regulatory equivalent of a parking ticket issued outside a stadium hosting a sold-out event. And this is where the actual paradox underneath all of this comes into focus. The Chinese farmland threat driving the political conversation represents 0.02% of American agricultural land, and it has been shrinking since its 2021 peak. The institutional transformation of who owns American soil, driven by hedge funds, pension vehicles, publicly traded REITs, and foreign renewable energy companies from allied nations, has restructured ownership across nearly a third of non-farmer held land, with almost no equivalent political attention. The regulatory apparatus is being sharpened and expanded specifically against the smaller declining problem, while the broader structural shift in land ownership continues largely without challenge. The point is not that the national security concern is wrong. The point is that national security is functioning as the frame for a much larger and harder conversation that almost nobody wants to have directly. That conversation is about what it means for food security and rural economics when the land that grows American food becomes primarily a vehicle for institutional financial returns. The University of Illinois agricultural land economist Bruce Sherrick has argued that foreign investors own very little of American agricultural land, and that media coverage is disproportionate to the actual impact on food supply. On the raw numbers, he is correct. But those same numbers show that institutional ownership, both domestic and foreign combined, has expanded by 85% across 15 years. The more uncomfortable question is not who owns the land today. It is who can realistically afford to own it in another decade, what their priorities will be when they do, and whether those priorities are compatible with long-term food security. The National Farm Security Action Plan and the expanded CFIUS rules, built on the foundation of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018, known as FIRRMA, gave the government in November 2024 the authority to review real estate transactions near more than 60 additional military installations. This represents the most serious structural attempt in several decades to bring meaningful oversight to this space. Whether that oversight is sufficient to address the full scope of what has changed is a separate question, and it is not one that the current political framing is particularly set up to answer. What the data confirms is that the story of American farmland in the 21st century is not primarily a story about foreign espionage. It is a story about an asset class that became too financially attractive to ignore. A regulatory framework built in 1978 that is only now being updated for the world that actually exists, and a widening gap between who works the land and who holds title to it. The soil itself has not changed. The people with a legal claim on it have changed enormously, and the pace of that change has accelerated with every year that institutional capital has treated American dirt as a reliable substitute for bonds. If the gap between what American farmland policy claims to protect and what the ownership data actually shows is the kind of story that holds your attention, this channel covers exactly that territory. The next AFIDA report will show which direction foreign holdings moved through 2025, and that analysis will be here when it lands. The land is still there. The question is simply who it belongs to now, and whether the answer to that question is something anyone is genuinely prepared to act on.